All right, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Tuesday morning Bible study. We are in Genesis, and today we're going to very quickly and briefly run through chapter 36, having left off as we did at the end of chapter 35. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time today beginning to look at chapter 37. And I'll say more about that when we get to it. Of course, where we left off last week was with the end of chapter 35 and the death of Isaac. We saw in chapter 35, verses 27 through 29, that Isaac died and that Jacob and Esau together buried him. And I was just, and in fact was buried in the same plot, in the same land that Isaac's father and mother, Abraham and Sarah, had been buried in. Isaac is said to have been 180 years old on his death. And then verse 29, breathed his last and he died. And this is such a rich biblical phrase, was gathered to his people, old and full of days. I know. I always think of one of the reasons why I love J.R.R. Tolkien so much is because Tolkien had a biblical flair in his own use of language, but biblical / Shakespearean flair for language. And so when Theoden, king of Rohan, dies in Return of the King, he has Theoden say, "I go now to my fathers, in whose mighty company I shall not now feel ashamed." That's so good. That's so good. Okay, so with him being gathered to his people, old and full of days, Esau and Jacob bury him. All right, so chapter 36, the entire chapter is dedicated to a listing of Esau's descendants. You will recall that this is done, just off the top of my head, I believe this was done one other time, where the descendants are given of a son who is not otherwise going to be continued in the narrative. Okay, you will recall that this was done with Ishmael, Abraham's son Ishmael. We know that the line continues on through Isaac. But a chapter is dedicated to, or a portion of a chapter is dedicated to delineating the descendants of Ishmael. Well, in the same way, we are not going to continue with the line of Esau. But the redactor regarded it as important to talk about the descendants of that brother. What's interesting too, and I mean, it's just again a little curious feature, curious recurring theme, is that just as Ishmael was the older son, Esau was the older son, and yet they're not the one being continued. Their story is not being continued. Just a little interesting feature. All right, so chapter 36, just in the name of being able to say at the end of this study that you read every single word of the book of Genesis, we're going to read it, and I'm just going to make a couple of comments, and then if y'all have any comments on it, you are welcome to make them. The chapter, and I will have just a few places where I'll say something, but all right, chapter 36. These are the descendants of Esau, that is Edom. Esau took his wives from the Canaanites, Adah, daughter of Elon the Hittite, oh boy, Oholibamah, daughter of Anah, son of Zibeon the Hivite, and Basemath, Ishmael's daughter, sister of Nebaioth. Ada bore Eliphaz to Esau. Basemath bore Reuel, and Oholibamah bore Jehush, Jalam, and Korah. These are the sons of Esau who were born to him in the land of Canaan. It's too bad Wendy Arthur's not here. I would taunt her with the idea, oh, this is going to be the Old Testament reading this Sunday, right? have her be the liturgist. All right. Then Esau took his wives, his sons, his daughters, and all the members of his household, his cattle, all his livestock, and all the property he had acquired in the land of Canaan. And he moved to a land some distance from his brother Jacob. For their possessions were too great for them to live together. The land where they were staying could not support them because of their livestock. So Esau settled in the hill country of Seir. Esau is Edom. Okay, just real quick, I'll say this is a peaceful parting. This is a peaceful parting, just as ultimately Ishmael and Isaac have what is ultimately a peaceful parting. This is a peaceful parting. So verse 9, these are the descendants of Esau, ancestor of the Edomites in the hill country of Seir. Now, later on in the biblical narrative, we know that the Edomites are Israel's enemies. Okay, so that's an important thing to just kind of keep in the back of your mind. But there's no evidence of that enmity here. Ancestor of the Edomites in the hill country of Seir. These are the names of Esau's sons: Eliphaz, son of Ada, the son of the wife of Esau; Reuel, the son of Esau's wife, Basemath. The sons of Eliphaz were Teman, Omar, Zepho, Gatam, and Kenaz. Timnah was a concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son. She bore Amalek to Eliphaz. These were the sons of Ada, Esau's wife. These were the sons of Reuel, Nahath, Zerah, Shammah, and Mitzah. These were the sons of Esau's wife, Basemath. These were the sons of Esau's wife, Oholibamah, daughter of Anah, son of Zibeon. She bore to Esau, Jehush, Jalam, and Korah. These are the clans of the sons of Esau: the sons of Eliphaz, the firstborn of Esau, the clans Teman, Omar, Zephar, Kenaz, Korah, Galam, and Amalek. These are the clans of Eliphaz in the land of Edom. They are the sons of Ada. These are the sons of Esau's son Reuel, the clans Nahath, Zerah, Shammah, and Mitzah. These are the clans of Reuel in the land of Edom. They are the sons of Esau's wife Basemath. These are the sons of Esau's wife Oholibamah, the clans Jehush, Jalam, and Korah. These are the clans born of Esau's wife Oholibamah, the daughter of Anah. These are the sons of Esau, that is Edom, and these are their clans. Okay, I'm not going to do this. I'm sorry. You read it on your own, and then you can say that you've read it all.
Thank you.
It's I mean, it's pointless. One thing I will point out, if you go down to verse 28, where it says, these are the sons of Dishon, and it says Uz and Aran. Uz, I don't know if does Uz call to mind anything later in the Bible?
Came where Abraham was.
Nope.
No,
no, that was Ur. That was
okay.
UR, not UZ.
Okay.
So what is UZ? Uz. Who was from Uz? Job.
Oh.
Job was, if you read the early first chapter of the book of Job, it says that Job was from the land of Uz. And really the only really meaningful thing that one could derive from that is that by that time, the land of Uz was considered an unrighteous land. It was considered, just as the Edomites become Israel's enemies, the land of Uz was considered a bad land. And so for Job to be Job in the land of Uz is like being it was like being Noah in the, in the earth, at the time he was. He was a righteous man in the midst of great unrighteousness, under great pressure to be unrighteous, and yet isn't. But here you are. You've got this. You've got delineation of all the descendants of Esau. It is clearly meant to be. It's clearly meant to just establish the relationship of Israel to these surrounding nations. It's also clearly the work of the P source, the priestly source, because truly the only source that cares anything about this kind of thing is the priestly source. Whenever you see these elaborate genealogies in the book of Genesis, think the priestly source. All right. And so with the end of chapter 36, we move into chapter 37. And this is actually, as you know, one of the most familiar texts in the book of Genesis. Widely beloved, musical written about it. In fact, I was tempted to hunt up some Andrew Lloyd Webber on Spotify and have it playing during this class, but I decided against it. So anyway, chapter 37 is the beginning of, it's the beginning of the end of the book of Genesis. It's the final cycle. We talked about the book of Genesis being justly divided into different sections. And we said that we spoke of the primeval history, which was chapters 1 through 11. Then we talked about chapters 12 through 25 being the Abraham cycle. Okay. Then we talked about like the halfway through chapter 25 through chapter 36 as the Jacob cycle. And then finally, chapters 37 through 50 is the Joseph cycle. Now, one of the more interesting aspects of all this is that you may not have thought of this yet, but the descendancy of Joseph is not carried out. It's not followed through. Nobody of any significance in the later story of Israel is descended from Joseph, or at least it's not spelled out in such that way. I mean, all the people that we think of, that we're really focused on in subsequent Old Testament history and then into the New Testament are descendants of one of two people, either Judah, okay, either from Judah or from Benjamin. Okay, and we know, for instance, the Apostle Paul is of the tribe of Benjamin. So he's, reputedly a descendant of the youngest of these brothers of Jacob, or of these sons of Jacob, Benjamin. And pretty much everybody else of note, I mean, other than, the priests, you've got, Levi and all that. But then you've got, but pretty much everybody else is a descendant of Judah. The tribe of Judah, King David, Jesus himself. I mean, that whole thing is through Judah. Okay. And so it's interesting, just on the face of it, that so much time and attention is given to this person who is not going to be the ancestor of anybody of note going forward. It is, however, an occasion to develop further the theme of brotherly rivalry. Okay, and that has been going on throughout this book, is the theme of brotherly rivalry. And Now, one thing that is quite different actually about chapters 37 through 50 is that with the exception of chapter 38 does serve as a counterexample to this. But the rest of this block, this 37 through 50, represents a singular unfolding narration. That is to say, it's a continuous story. If you go back and you think about the story, the narration of Abraham's life, of Isaac's life, of Jacob's life, you'll see that the narration is episodic. Okay, in other words, the story about Abraham in chapter 17 and the story of Abraham in chapter 24, I mean, you could roughly say that, one happens before the other, but they represent self-contained stories. Okay, they're episodes. They're episodes that don't build on each other necessarily, except in the loosest chronological way. Okay, but they don't, like in other words, if you see episode 17, chapter 17 or episode 17, you could, or if you don't see chapter 17, episode 17, you could watch episode 24 and understand everything that's going on. Okay, whereas in this cycle, 37 through 50, with the exception of chapter 38, the story is progressive. It builds on itself such that you kind of need to know what happened in chapter 38 to understand what's going on in chapter 39. And you got to understand chapter 39 to understand what's going on in 40. It's a progressive story. It builds on itself. Okay. So that is the really important thing to know about that. One final thing before we start reading the text, that is, I am yet to come up with a specific significance to this. But but I want you to pay attention to the number of times in this cycle that God directly speaks, that God is an active character in the story in terms of speaking or revealing himself. How many times does it happen? It happens a grand total of one time. In 13 chapters, God speaks in a form of outward, revelation one time. And it's almost in passing. Okay. God was much more active in the Abraham story, for instance. I mean, God as a character, God as an active speaker and actor, a character in the story. God is much more active in the Abraham cycle. He's fairly active in the Jacob cycle. He is hardly active in the same sense in this cycle at all. He's hardly there at all. And yet, he's in the background the entire time. And the events as they unfold are understood to be under the providential guidance of God. Okay. But God is not inserting himself into the story the way it happens in the other chapters. Okay. All right.
It wouldn't be the priestly source then, is it the other source?
It's a composite. Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's like, many of the other cycles. It's a composite of your J, E, and P. But it's just interesting that even in the J parts, even in the J and E parts that make up this cycle, and there are J and E parts in this cycle, you don't have God as an active speaking character in the way that you do in the other cycles. just an interesting feature. I don't know what, if any, real significance one might draw from that. But it is certainly true that the way God operates in terms of, kind of like providentially guiding things in the background is something that is going to be important for Jewish theology and in the mind of Paul, for instance, too. This idea that God, even if God is in the background, that God is still nevertheless, in the words of Romans 8, working all things together for good, because that's exactly what's going on in these chapters, is that, Joseph, for a good portion of this cycle, Joseph does not have a comfortable life. And yet God is behind the scenes taking things that were meant for evil and turning them into good, so that Joseph's being sold into slavery ultimately becomes the very thing that saves Israel. Okay. And so there's some delicious, wonderful irony here. And but yeah, it very much does inform a later view of God's providence. All right. So let's get to it. This is a great story and a familiar story, but let's dig into it. Chapter 37. I'm going to read up to verse 11. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Okay. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field, and suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. He had another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I have had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Okay. All right. Thoughts? What are some thoughts that you have on this?
I thought it was interesting at the very beginning when it says that Joseph was the favorite because he had been born in his father's old age.
Mm-hmm.
He did not say because he was Rachel's son, which we would think was the most important reason that he liked him the best, but they don't say that.
Yeah, no, so it's an interesting point. I don't really have a good response to that. I mean, just humanly speaking, I can understand why he would favor Joseph. and by extension, Benjamin. I can understand why he might, because he loved Rachel. But yeah, it is curious. It is curious that particular thing is not mentioned. It is also interesting, kind of along those same lines, and this is one of those little inconsistencies that the redactor might have missed. Okay. Notice the dream in if you look at verse 9, where it says, "Look, I have had another dream. The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." And this obviously is a pointer to his family, right? Okay. And the sun and the moon and the stars. Now we know the stars are the brothers. The sun has to be Jacob. Who's the moon? The moon is Rachel. I mean, it has to be his mother. And then if you look at Jacob's response to Joseph, he says, "What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you?" Now, if you recall from chapter 35, Rachel died. Rachel's dead at this point. Okay. And yet, this text would at least seem to suggest, at least on the outward, it would seem to suggest that Rachel's still alive at this point, and that somehow Rachel's death somehow happened after Joseph is revealing this bit about the dream. That is one possible answer, perhaps the only possible answer that I can come up with, Lois, to your point, is that at least from the context of this exchange, that Rachel's not actually dead, and therefore there would not be the same need for the narrator to say Joseph was his favorite because Joseph was the son of his beloved deceased wife, or something like that.
Is this the only reference to Rachel in this?
Yes, Rachel does not appear.
Then it seems to me that maybe Rachel could be dead, and Jacob could still bring up her image when he's talking about, if he sees the sun and the moon and the 11 stars, that he could include Rachel even though she's dead.
Sure.
I don't think it necessarily has to mean that she's still alive.
I agree. No, I know. I agree. I definitely agree. That's absolutely right. It would possibly, oh dear, Bill just emailed me, or you saw he disappeared. He just emailed me and said that the power went out. Oh dear. Oh dear.
Where does he live? Where does Bill?
In Carrollton.
Oh, he's in
Carrollton, Georgia.
And that's where you were before you came to Akron.
Yeah, I was an interim at Carrollton Presbyterian for 2 years. It was a good church, and good people. And Bill's one of my favorite guys.
It seems to me like he found such displeasure from his brothers when he told them about the first dream. You wonder why he even told them about the second one.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great point. He was, it's like the guy's just completely oblivious. I mean, it's like he just doesn't get it. I mean, it's like if he had any inkling of how much he was loathed by his brothers after he did it the first time, you would think he'd have enough self-awareness to say, you know what, maybe next time I have a dream, maybe I'll keep it to myself.
Yeah.
He's 17. Okay, he's 17 years old. I don't know that I could come down on him too hard. I mean, I think back and I think about myself at 17, and in some ways I was a little too smart for my own good, and and found myself found myself, getting into trouble of my own making, that sometimes came out of that. So there's part of me that can relate to Joseph or feel for Joseph. But I can also say, man, you just walked right into that, didn't you? Walked right into that trouble. Yeah, he's really.
Well, he strikes me as a little smart aleck.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm just going to send a quick. Hope you can rejoin us soon. I was just.
Why do we always bring our phones up to our mouths when we all do that?
Right. Well, Joseph is kind of a smart aleck. Now 17 is an interesting age, and some commentators make a lot of that. He's said to be 17, and by that, and in the whole 12 years old and bar mitzvah and all that, you're legally an adult and all that stuff. Look, Jews know that 12-year-old boys are not adults. I mean, they know that. That you may be, you've been bar mitzvahed, and so you have certain rights and privileges that you didn't have when you were 11. Sure. But Jews are like every other group of people. They know that 12-year-old boys are not adults yet. In the same way, 17-year-old boys are not grown up either. So he's 17, and so he's old enough to have deep thoughts. He's old enough to be clever, and to be, to have deep thoughts and whatnot. But he's also not a grown-up. And so it's like he can be really gifted, but not quite know how to act yet. Okay. Quite not.
The women were so young when they married. Were the men not?
Usually men were a little older. Yeah. Usually it would, a typical thing would be like a young teenager on the girl side. And I think Bill's coming back. And typically you'd be like in your early 20s or mid 20s. There we go. There you are. Hey, Bill. Good to have you back. Okay. Let's see. But yeah, I'll just say that, there is I agree with you, Lois, that it's not, that little detail doesn't show that Rachel is in fact alive. It is something that some commentators have wondered about, and have wondered if, maybe this is just, from the standpoint of this particular source telling this story, that this source is different from the other source that says that, the other source in chapter 35 that says that Rachel died, that it's like that these two sources are not entirely consistent with one another, and that from the storyteller's mind in this story, Rachel is still alive, and so there's not the same urgency to assert that Joseph is so loved by his father because he's the son of Rachel. It's that would, from that storyteller's point of view, that would still be something that everyone would know. Everyone would know that he was that and would be favored. But yeah, there's no sure way to resolve it. No sure way to know for sure. So.
And for one thing, when we dream, we certainly dream about people that have passed on, and
that too.
We see them still alive in our dream.
Right. Yeah, it's a good point. Good point too. And people do things in our dreams that are the weirdest things.
Yes.
People say things, they do things in dreams that Just the weirdest things. And if I told you, if I said, Mom and Dad, I dreamed, and the two of you were doing whatever, you'd might justly look at me and just say, what in the world are you smoking? I mean, what in the world? What in the world? Where did that dream come from? And but Joseph is clearly of the view at 17, he is of the view that dreams mean something. Okay, there's a reason why I had this dream. Now, later on, we're going to see that Joseph's ability to dream and then interpret dreams is going to be something that is going to take him a long way. Joseph is a very, very clever and smart person. And dream interpretation in the Old Testament is associated with wisdom. It's associated with deep insight. The ability to interpret a dream means that you've got a real gift. Okay. And so Joseph is seen as very gifted. He's also 17. Okay. And so there you go. So take those two facts and combine them. All right. Okay. So let's go on to verse 12. So we know how much Joseph is hated. Verse 12, now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel, or Jacob, said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. He answered, here I am. So he said to him, go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, what are you seeking? He said, I am seeking my brothers. He said, tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. The man said, they have gone away, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. Go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, carrying gum, balm, and resin, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Let me just go ahead and finish the chapter, and we'll talk about the whole thing. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. Now, I'm just going to say right here, this is an interesting little detail, because wasn't Reuben part of all this thing about this is a good example of where sources come together, and sometimes it's not completely seamless. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Okay. Very, very famous story here. Okay, so what are some things here? Now, just granting right off the bat, there's a few little minor inconsistencies, but the basic idea is pretty clear. Okay. What do you think?
Well, something that amazes me that we don't hear anything. I mean, Joseph has been so smart and speaking up and telling stuff, and now he doesn't say a word.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Later on, there's going to be a mention when the brothers, go down to Egypt. There's going to be a mention of some things that Joseph said during this whole ordeal. But no, you're right. I mean, nothing is said by Joseph here. Yeah. What else? There are a number of little details that are just interesting here. Shechem. Remember Shechem? Shechem, this is where he's supposed to be able to find them. They told Jacob that that's where they were going, was they're going to Shechem, pasturing the flocks at Shechem. And remember, Shechem was where Reuben and Simeon had gotten into, such trouble. It slaughtered all the people of Shechem, and Jacob was very upset about what possibly could come of that. So there's that. Take a look at verses 19 and 20. Where it says, "They said to one another, 'Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams.'" Kind of ironic, isn't it? It's this very course of action, thinking that they're going to stamp out his dreams. It's taking this very course of action that sets into motion the events that will fulfill those dreams. And this is like classic Greek tragedy, in a way, so you get a prophecy, and there's a prophecy, and it's a prophecy you don't like. And so you take steps to keep it from happening. And it's precisely the steps that you take to keep it from happening that cause it to happen. Okay. That is the essence of Greek tragedy right there, is the very steps you take to avoid fate only seals it. And this happens here because this is the mechanism by which Joseph is going to get down to Egypt and ultimately be in a position for his brothers later, much later, to bow to him and so forth. Oh gosh.
Is there, I mean, it talks here about the long sleeved robe a few times, and that's what they put in blood. Now we have the idea that it was a multicolored robe. Is there some reference to that in some other text anywhere? Or where did that come from?
That's a good point. I don't think so. I don't think so. That's a good point, though. I wish I should have anticipated that question. And I don't have a good answer to it in the moment. I should have thought of that.
That was pre-Weber, wasn't it? The idea of a multi, even in Sunday school, I think I remember reading about.
Yeah, no, I do too. And I'm trying to, I need to come up with where that idea comes from. Because it may actually be from later on in the text, and I just didn't look it up. Now the one thing, regardless of what color it was, the thing that really matters, the most important thing that matters about the robe is that the robe signifies Joseph's belovedness and his family identity. It signifies his belovedness by his father and his being his father's son. That's what the robe represents. And so for them to strip him of his robe is symbolically to strip him of his identity. Okay. This is the substitute for killing him because it's a kind of symbolic death. Okay. This is, because originally the plan was we're just going to kill him. And then Reuben, and then later in another source, Judah, represents the voice of reason, the voice of reason. But maybe it's not a great idea to actually kill him. Let's just kind of make it like we killed him. We can deliver the same effect. We'll be rid of him, but without actually having his blood on our hands. Okay. So again, in one sort, it's Reuben in one case, and then Judah in the other, and they're kind of somewhat inconsistently put together, but each represents, in these different sources, the voice of reason. But yeah, this is what the stripping of the robe means. Now, one interesting thing to look for as you go forward in the overall narrative, as we get, more and more to the end of the book, you'll see that there are two other places where Joseph's changing of clothes marks the change, a change of identity. Okay, two other places, because being stripped of clothes, he becomes a slave. Now, then he's going, in a few chapters from now, he's going to go from being a slave to being a prisoner. Okay. And so he's going to exchange slave clothes for prison clothes. But then we know there's going to be some dreams involved in this, but he is going to get recognized for his gifts, and he's actually going to be brought into Pharaoh's court. And there's going to be a change of clothes. And I mean, the text actually spells this out, that he is given a change of clothes as he assumes this new position. So with a changing of clothes comes a changing of identity. One thing I want you to notice, and this may be worth some reflection. You remember when we talked about when we talked about the return of Jacob, when Jacob was coming back and he was about to face Esau, and then finally he does see Esau. And there's this, when they actually see each other, they run towards each other and they embrace and they kiss each other, and it's a, you know, a grand homecoming. Okay. And we said at the time that if you think of the, you know, this is the homecoming of Israel. This is Israel coming home. Okay. Israel being restored to the family, as it were. We speculated that there might be some connection in Jesus's mind when he told the parable of the prodigal son. When he told the parable of the prodigal son, and the son returns and the father is waiting, and when they see each other, they run towards each other, and the father hugs him and kisses him. Okay. And we speculated that in Jesus's mind, as he told that story, Jesus himself may very well have, at least in part, been drawing on imagery from the return of Jacob, who was renamed Israel, remember, before it happened. And so it's Israel returning home. It's the people of God returning home, being received back into the family again. Okay. Now here's one more little piece. Here's one more thing that connects Jesus's parable of the prodigal son to this broader narrative in Genesis. Joseph is stripped of his clothes. Okay. He is stripped of his identity. What happens? And he's stripped of his identity by the stripping of his clothes. Okay. What happens when the prodigal son returns and after they hug and kiss and all that? What does the father say?
Put on the robe.
Put on a robe. Put a ring on his finger. We give him a fresh robe and ring on his finger and shoes for his feet. And it's a restoration to the family. The putting on of the robe means a restoration to the family. Again, I can't help but believe that when Jesus told that story, that he's thinking of these older stories, these older narratives. And so the parable of the prodigal son then has some depths of meaning and significance that that we might never see, might never notice if we're not thinking of, you know, the story of Jacob returning home, and then the story of Joseph being stripped of his clothes. And so it's and then of course the other thing is, and this doesn't have to do with Jesus and parable of the prodigal son, but it does have to do with symbolic death. And that is, he's thrown, remember, Joseph is thrown into a pit. Okay. In Hebrew thought, death was described as Sheol, right? That was the state of death, was Sheol. Well, Sheol means pit. In the Old Testament, in Psalms, you know, in the Psalms, there's references to, you know, how my life was in the pit. Okay, it means like my life was in the midst of the shadow of death. Okay, it was in Sheol, it was in the pit, it was in a kind of death, separation from love and relationships and all living in this state of death. And so when Joseph is stripped of his clothes, he's stripped of his identity, and then he is given a kind of symbolic death by being placed into the pit. and that everything that follows then follows the stripping of his identity and his being symbolically killed. Everything that follows is that. Okay, let's see. Now I know it's 11:32, so we probably need to be wrapping up here. Of course, he is sold into slavery. He goes down to Egypt. We're told at the end that he's going to be sold to Potiphar, who's one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. We're going to see that has great significance, in part because Potiphar's wife insists on being part of the story. All right. The final piece before we head out, as I do want you to notice that we have with verses 29 through the end of the chapter, we have yet another example of a recurring theme. What is this recurring theme? When the brothers go back to Jacob, what's the recurring theme here?
That Jacob tears his clothes.
Well, okay. Well, that's an interesting observation. I don't know. I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of that. I want to think on that a little bit. I don't know if that is something that I don't know if we can weave something out of that or not. I don't know. The thing I was going to point out was the fact that once again we have an old man deceived by his son or sons. Mm-hmm. Just as Jacob was deceived his father Isaac, mm-hmm. so in the same way, Jacob himself is deceived by his sons. And in some fashion, in some of the same ways. Clothes are involved. I mean, remember before it was all about, him putting animal skins on his arms so that when Isaac felt him, blind Isaac, would feel him, he'd say, oh, okay, that's Esau, right? So clothes were involved. The food was involved. This whole thing of being devoured, being eaten, there was that, and it's a deception then that sets up. It doesn't just end there. It's not just a deception that ends there and everything just proceeds on. It's that everything that happens after is a direct consequence of this deception. Okay. And so, this deception is going to have, this whole act that led to the deception has highly consequential consequences for the future. And of course, in this case, it's good for everybody in the end, but it doesn't look like it's going to be, but in the providence of God, it is worked out to be something wonderful that comes out of something terrible. And in the same way, just, it's Jacob's deception, with Jacob's deception of Isaac, everything that follows, Jacob fleeing, Jacob going back to going back to his ancestral, to his family's ancestral homeland, and finding Rachel and Leah, and that whole history happens because of Jacob's deception of Isaac. If he had never deceived Isaac, none of that would have presumably happened. Okay. And so it's highly consequential. But so the narrator of Genesis loves to repeat themes and to have themes like this recur. All right. Bill, you're going to be able to later on, if you want to see the recording, you can catch up on some of those missing pieces. All right. Okay, well, let's see, we actually did reach the end of the chapter, didn't we?
Mhm.
Okay, now next time we are going to pick up with chapter 38. Now 38, as I said already, is an exception to the larger rule that chapters 37 through 50 function as an ongoing narrative, as an unfolding ongoing narrative, where one thing follows from the thing before. Chapter 38 does kind of represent an independent tradition, an independent story. But it is significant. It is quite significant. It's a little, it's a little dark, but it's not, it's just, but it is consequential. It is quite interesting. Okay. All right. Well, we're at the end today. I've got some fun. I'm about to go off and have a lunch with somebody, a pastor nearby who's an interim pastor, and I'm using my experience as an interim pastor myself to help this guy along the path of developing a mission study and that kind of thing. And we're gonna something that can pass muster with the Committee on Ministry. So oh boy.
For those of you who think your internet is slow, it took me a full 20 to 30 minutes to get my computer booted back up and get back in after the power went off. It was incredible.
Yeah. No,
I listened on my phone for most of the time while it was off, so that was good.
Okay, good. Okay, so you didn't actually miss that much then. All right. Okay, well, I'm sorry that happened, but I'm glad that you were able to join in that alternative way. Okay, well, let's close with prayer, and then I'll be off to my. Actually, I've got to write something before I do that, but I hope all of you have a good rest of the day. Let's pray. God, we give you thanks for this day and for this opportunity to gather in this way as we do each week, and to study the scriptures and to discern your voice speaking to us still today through these ancient stories. We thank you now that we're in the Joseph cycle of the story, and thank you for the opportunity to dig deeply into it and to see all that you did to bring good out of evil, to bring good out of what was meant for evil, and how you turned it to good. Lord, we pray for all those in need, for all those who are struggling or suffering in this time, for the sick, for the suffering, for those who've experienced great loss. We pray for your healing and for your strength. Lord, we continue to pray for Bill Allworth and pray for Lois as she looks after him, and we pray for each one of us and for our friends and families, and bring before you now those needs that we hold in our hearts. And so now we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Go Braves!
Go Braves! Yeah.
Go Braves! I hope so.
I hope so too. Man, I thought they had it the other night.
I know.
But I was saying to somebody yesterday that with the Braves up, before Sunday night, the Braves were up, 3-1, just one more to go. But I said, I've been an Atlanta sports fan for way too long to get cocky.
I remember 1999 all too well.
Yeah. That and the Super Bowl being up 25 points in the third quarter. No, we don't count our chickens before they're hatched. That is a mistake. All right. Well, y'all have a good rest of the day, and Mom and Dad, if you'll hold on after everybody goes.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I'm supposed to hold on. He wants to talk.